For 3,000 years, one of the richest empires the world has ever known ran without a single coin. Egypt built the pyramids. It fed 100 cities. It paid an army of workmen generation after generation. And it did all of it before anyone in the Nile Valley had ever struck a piece of money. No gold coins, no silver, nothing you could drop into a purse and hear jingle. But here is the part that should stop you. This was not barter. Egypt was not a land of farmers swapping chickens for sandals. It was one of the most carefully counted economies in all of history. A worker could be paid in grain he could never carry home, and still spend it anywhere in the kingdom on a single line of writing. Egypt had wages, it had credit, it had something very close to banking. It simply had no coins. So how do you run a superpower for 3,000 years without money as we know it? The answer was written down on papyrus long before the first coin was ever struck. Let's follow it.
To understand Egyptian money, you have to let go of one idea, that money must be a thing you can hold. Because the first thing Egypt invented was not a coin, it was a number. They called it the Deben. A Deben was a unit of weight, about 91 grams of metal, usually copper, divided into 10 smaller units, each called a kite. But here is the brilliant part. The Deben was almost never a coin that changed hands. It was a measuring stick for value. A scribe could price anything in Deben, a wooden bed, a bowl, a field of barley. So many Deben for the bed, so many for the bowl. And then two people could simply trade the bed for the bowl, agreeing that their values matched, while not a scrap of metal moved between them. Think about what that means. They had split the idea of money away from the substance of money. Value lived in the record, in the agreed number, not in a coin in your fist. We tend to assume coins came first and accounting came later. Egypt did it the other way around. The measure of money came first. The coin came 3,000 years behind it. So how was an ordinary Egyptian actually paid? For most people, the answer was grain, not as charity, as a wage. Picture one of the skilled workmen who cut the royal tombs, living in the village we now call Deir el-Medina. At the end of the month, he did not receive coins. He received sacks of wheat and barley, bread and beer measured out. The standard sack was called a khar, and it was a fixed measure worth 2 deben of copper. An ordinary workman earned around 5.5 sacks a month. A foreman or a scribe who kept the accounts earned more, around 7.5. But grain is heavy, and it spoils, and no one can eat 5 sacks of wheat before it turns. So a wage in grain only works if grain can be stored, saved, and spent like money. And in Egypt, it could. Your pay was not really the wheat itself. It was a claim on wheat, a number in the granaries books that you could draw on, trade away, or lend. The bread on the table was a salary, and the salary was written down. And because the wage was written down, we know exactly what happened when it failed to arrive. In the 29th year of the pharaoh Ramses III, around 1157 BCE, the system broke. In Deir el-Medina, the rations were late. Not by a day, by 18 days. The men who built the tombs of god kings sat at home with empty granaries and hungry children. And so they did something no record anywhere on earth had ever described before. They stopped working. They laid down their tools, walked out, and marched to the temples where the grain was stored. And there they staged a sit-in, refusing to move until they were paid. One of them cried out a line that still reaches across 3,000 years. "We are hungry." A scribe named Amenanoct wrote it all down day by day on the document we now call the Turin Strike Papyrus. This is the first labor strike in recorded history. And notice what it tells us. These were not slaves building for free under the whip. That is a myth. They were paid workers with an agreement they understood. And when the state broke that agreement, they knew they had leverage and they used it. The paycheck and the strike, it turns out, are the very same story.
You cannot walk out over wages you were never promised.
So where was all that grain kept? And how could a man spend a harvest he could not carry? Here, Egypt did something that looks, from a distance, remarkably like banking. Across the kingdom stood the state granaries, vast storehouses that took in the surplus of every harvest. When you handed your grain to the granary, you did not simply give it away. It was credited to you and recorded. And once it was on the books, you could draw it back out a little at a time. Or, and this is the crucial part, you could pay someone else with it without touching a single grain. You sent a written order to the granary telling the keeper to move grain from your account to another man's. The wheat never moved, only the record changed. Historians sometimes call these the grain banks and compare a grain receipt to an early kind of paper money. Now, that comparison is a loose analogy. These were not banknotes, but the machinery underneath is unmistakable. Store value in one place, move it with a signature, trust the record more than the metal. That is the deep idea of banking, and Egypt was running it on wheat.
And who owned the biggest granaries of all? Not the palace, the temples. We picture Egyptian temples as places of prayer and incense, and they were. But they were also the largest business enterprises in the ancient world. Take the greatest of them, the domain of Amun, centered on the temple of Karnak. It was not merely a house of a god. It was a vast, vertically integrated corporation. It owned farmland and cattle by the tens of thousands. It owned vineyards and mines and fishing grounds, workshops and warehouses. It owned its own fleet of ships to move goods along the Nile. And it employed a small nation of people, farmers, herdsmen, weavers, scribes, sailors, all on its payroll. How rich were the temples together? By one reading of the surviving records, they may have controlled something approaching a third of all the farmland in Egypt. That figure is only an estimate, and historians argue over it. But even the argument tells you the scale. Much of what we know comes from a single astonishing scroll, listing the gifts of Ramesses III to the temples. It is called the Great Papyrus Harris, and it is the longest papyrus ever found. Unrolled, it stretches more than 40 meters, some 41 in all. The gods, it turns out, were the great landlords of the Nile. Put it together, wages, granaries, temple estates, and you start to see the machine that actually ran Egypt. It was not the pharaoh's army. It was the scribe's pen. Everything was counted. Each year, when the Nile flooded and then fell back, scribes walked the fields and measured them, plot by plot, judging from the height of the flood how much each field should yield, and so how much tax it owed. And the tax was paid not in coins, but in kind, in grain, in cattle, in cloth, in labor. We can still hold the evidence in our hands. One surviving land register, the Wilbur Papyrus, dates to around 1142 BCE. It records nearly 2,800 separate plots along about 140 kilometers of the valley, who worked them, who owned them, what they owed. And this counting was a genuine science. Scribes trained on mathematical handbooks, the most famous, the Rind Papyrus, copied by a scribe named Ames around 1550 BCE, from an original centuries older. It is full of the very problems a treasury clerk needed: how to share out loaves of bread among workers, how to reckon the strength of a grain ration. And Egypt could lend, too, loans of grain and goods that charged interest, long before there were any coins to lend. The real pyramid holding Egypt up was not made of stone. It was made of paperwork. So when did the coins finally arrive? Late. Very late. For most of Egyptian history, coined money simply did not exist here. Foreign coins did trickle in, Greek silver from Athens, stamped with an owl, but even those were not spent as coins. They were weighed like any other lump of silver and valued in Deben. Archaeologists have dug up hordes of them buried in the Egyptian delta at a site called Tel El Maskuta, hidden not as money, but as bullion by weight. The first coins actually made in Egypt did not appear until around 360 BCE, at the very end of the age of the pharaohs, struck by two of the last of them, Teos and Nectanebel II.
They were gold pieces, and their inscription read simply, "Good gold." And they were made for a blunt reason, to pay Greek mercenary soldiers who expected to be paid in coin. Then came the Greeks in force. When the dynasty of the Ptolemies took the throne, they laid a Greek banking system over Egypt's ancient one. They built royal banks, the Basilikae Trapezi in the great cities, fed by local branches and village tax offices. They capped interest by law, around 24% a year on loans of money and up to about 50% on loans of grain. And they sealed the borders to foreign coins, forcing every newcomer to change his money at a royal bank. The counting empire had finally been given coins.
And with those royal banks came the invention that finally earns the name. Under the Ptolemies, the grain accounts of the whole country were gathered and centralized, ultimately at the great capital, Alexandria. Once your wealth was a number in a central ledger, you could settle a debt hundreds of miles away without moving a single coin or a single grain, just by ordering the amount shifted from your account to another. Payment by pure book transfer. Historians call it giro banking, and this was one of the earliest true giro systems in the world. So, was it really banking? Here is the honest answer. The deep DNA of money, wages, credit, taxation, the corporation, wealth stored as a number and moved by written order, is around 4,000 years old in Egypt, reaching back into the age of the pyramids. But true formal banking, deposits, book transfers, coins, and interest capped by law, all in one system, is younger. That is closer to 2,300 years old, and it arrived with the Greeks, built on the Egyptian foundation. Both were invented on the Nile, and both came before the coin, not after it. In another of our stories, we watched an empire's money die in barely a century, its silver coins quietly hollowed out from within. Egypt is the mirror image. Its money was never truly made of metal. It was made of records and trust and the harvest, and it lasted 3,000 years. The lesson the Nile leaves us is quiet, and it is enormous. Money was never about coins. It was about who keeps the count. The DNA of modern money was written on papyrus long before the first coin was ever struck. If this is the kind of story you're here for, subscribe and stay with us. Because next time, we leave the river behind and follow the money onto the greatest road the ancient world ever built. A road of silk and silver and ideas running from one end of the earth to the other. The Silk Road.